The 27th of November, 1944, dawned cold and merciless over Germany. Lieutenant Robert Johnson's P-51 Mustang sliced through the frigid European sky at 23,000 feet, his breath forming tiny crystals inside his oxygen mask. Below him, scattered across the infinite canvas of winter clouds, 300 American bomber crewmen flew in tight formation toward their target deep in Nazi territory. Johnson couldn't have known that within the next hour he would face a choice that would either cement his name in aviation history or become another forgotten casualty statistic of the Second World War. The bomber stream stretched for miles, massive B-17 flying fortresses and B-24. Liberators loaded with thousands of pounds of high explosives destined for German oil refineries. These lumbering giants, each carrying 10 men whose families waited anxiously back home in places like Iowa and Pennsylvania, depended entirely on fighter escorts like Johnson to shepherd them through the gauntlet of enemy defenses. His squadron of P-51s had been assigned to protect the rear formation, but mechanical failures and fierce headwinds had separated Johnson from his wingman. Now he flew alone, a solitary guardian, watching over hundreds of souls. Johnson scanned the horizon with practiced eyes, searching for the telltale glints of sunlight reflecting off enemy canopies. The Luftwaffe had been bloodied, but remained dangerous. German fighter pilots defending their homeland fought with desperate ferocity. Intelligence briefings had warned of increased enemy activity in this sector. The bomber crews knew it too. Johnson could see the waist gunners in the nearest B-17 swiveling their 50-caliber machine guns nervously, their breath visible in the unpressurized fuselages, where temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Then he saw them. High at 2 o'clock, emerging from a massive cloud bank like wolves descending on a flock, came 30 German fighters. Now Johnson's heart hammered against his ribcage as he identified them: Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, the finest fighters the Luftwaffe could field. They were forming up for a coordinated attack on the trailing bomber formation, the exact group Johnson had been assigned to protect. The mathematics were brutally simple and terrifying. 30 battle-hardened German pilots against 1 American in a lone P-51. If those fighters reached the bombers, they would tear through the formation like a chainsaw through paper. According to accounts preserved in the United States Air Force Historical Research Agency archives, Johnson faced an impossible decision in that crystallized moment. Standard doctrine dictated that a lone fighter should never engage superior numbers. It was tactical suicide. The rational choice would be to radio for help and shadow the enemy formation while waiting for reinforcements. But reinforcements were 15 minutes away, and the German fighters would reach the bombers in less than 5. Those 300 men in the bombers had no time to wait for doctrine or reinforcements. Johnson pushed his throttle forward, feeling the Packard-built Merlin engines surge beneath him. The P-51 accelerated toward the German formation like an arrow shot from a bow. He was outnumbered 30-1, outgunned and completely alone. Every ounce of training, every survival instinct, screamed at him to break off. Lieutenant Robert Johnson had made his choice. He would stand alone. As Johnson closed the distance toward the German formation, his hands moved with mechanical precision through the pre-combat checklist drilled into him during countless hours at fighter school. He switched his gun sight from safe to armed, feeling the electrical hum as the system powered up. His P-51 carried 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, with approximately 400 rounds per gun. Against 30 enemy fighters, ammunition conservation would mean the difference between life and death. He would get perhaps 30 seconds of sustained firing before running dry. The German formation leader spotted Johnson's approach. The enemy pilot's tactical decision revealed itself immediately instead of ignoring the lone American fighter and pressing their attack on the bombers. The Germans interpreted Johnson's aggressive charge as the vanguard of a larger fighter force. It was a gamble Johnson hadn't even consciously planned. The Luftwaffe commander, unable to see if dozens more P-51s lurked in the sun behind Johnson, made a fatal hesitation. He ordered 4 fighters to peel off and engage the approaching American while the main formation continued toward the bombers, but at reduced speed, waiting to see what developed. Johnson opened fire at 600 yards, far beyond the effective range of his weapons, but close enough to make his presence violently known. Tracers arced through the crystalline air like deadly fireflies. The 4 German fighters scattered, breaking their formation as they maneuvered to engage him. In that fragmentation lay Johnson's slim, hope-divided enemies were weaker enemies. The instant the Germans committed to individual dogfights rather than maintaining formation integrity, they surrendered their numerical advantage. The first Focke-Wulf 190 came head-on, of both aircraft hurtling toward each other at a combined speed exceeding 700 miles per hour. This was aerial combat at its most primitive and terrifying, two pilots playing chicken with tons of metal and explosives, each betting the other would flinch first. Johnson held his course steady, his right hand wrapped around the control stick, left hand managing throttle and mixture controls. The German pilot's wings lit up with muzzle flashes as 20mm cannon shells reached out toward Johnson's Mustang. Time compressed. Johnson felt rounds impact his aircraft metallic bangs, and the sharp smell of cordite flooding his cockpit. Warning lights flickered on his instrument panel. He squeezed his trigger at 300 yards, and the P-51 shuddered as all 6 machine guns fired simultaneously. The convergence point of his weapons, where all 6 streams of fire intersected, had been set at 300 yards, turning that point in space into a cone of absolute destruction. The Focke-Wulf flew directly into that cone. Johnson saw his tracers walking across the German fighter's engine, cowling. Metal shredded. The BMW radial engine exploded in a gout of flame and oil. Both aircraft flashed past each other with bare feet to spare, the speed of their passing creating turbulence that rattled Johnson's teeth. He craned his neck around, watching the Focke-Wulf trail black smoke as it spiraled downward. 1 down, 29 to go. But there was no time for celebration. The remaining 3 German fighters from the initial interception group were already on him, their positions plotted in his mind like a 3-dimensional chess problem. One came from below left, another diving from above right, the third attempting to slide onto his tail. Standard Luftwaffe. Tactics coordinate attacks from multiple angles to overwhelm the target's ability to defend. Johnson had perhaps 3 seconds before all 3 achieved firing positions. His muscles tensed as he prepared for the most violent maneuver in a fighter pilot's repertoire, full deflection barrel roll that would either save his life or tear his aircraft apart from the G-forces. The sky became a kaleidoscope of deadly geometry. Johnson's P-51 rolled inverted as he pulled the stick hard into his stomach, vision tunneling as blood drained from his head. The horizon spun wildly, clouds, earth, sky blurring into a nauseating spiral. Gray fog crept into the edges of his vision as he pulled 6 Gs, his body weighing over 1,000 pounds under the crushing acceleration. Behind him, tracer rounds cut through the space where his Mustang had been milliseconds before. The 2 German pilots, unable to match his instantaneous change of direction, overshot their firing solutions. He came out of the roll with his airspeed bleeding dangerously low, 160 miles per hour in an aircraft designed to fight at 300 plus. The P-51 shuddered on the edge of a stall, that dangerous moment when lift disappears and the fighter becomes a falling brick. Johnson coaxed the throttle forward gently, nursing the Merlin engine back to full power without flooding it. The airspeed indicator began climbing again. Behind him, the 3 German fighters were regrouping, circling like sharks who'd tasted blood. Meanwhile, the main German formation had closed to within 2 miles of the bomber stream. Johnson could see the lead B-17s beginning evasive maneuvers, desperate, almost futile effort given their lack of maneuverability. The bombers' only real defense lay in their massed firepower. Each B-17 bristled with 1350 caliber machine guns, and when bombers flew in tight formation, their fields of fire overlapped into what crews called a death zone. But that defense only worked when the bombers maintained formation integrity. German pilots knew if they could break up the bomber box, individual bombers became easy prey. Johnson made another decision that defied all tactical logic. Instead of continuing to dogfight the 3 Germans on his tail the fight he was already committed to, he broke off, diving toward the main enemy formation threatening the bombers. He was essentially turning his back on 3 enemies trying to kill him in order to engage 26 more. The mathematics of survival had become meaningless. Only one equation mattered now: keep the Germans away from the bombers. His dive gained tremendous speed, the airframe groaning as he pushed the P-51 to its structural limits. 400 miles per hour. 450. 500. The Mustang wasn't designed for this kind of sustained high-speed dive, but Johnson had no choice. He needed the energy, the combination of speed and altitude, that fighter pilots called energy state, to make one more slashing attack on the main formation before they reached the bombers. He pulled out of the dive 1,000 yards behind the German formation, his vision narrowing to gray tunnel again as he pulled hard Gs. The P-51 leveled out, and Johnson immediately selected the rearmost German fighter in the enemy formation. The Messerschmitt 109 flew straight and level. Its pilot focused on the approaching bombers, unaware of the predator behind him. Johnson closed to 400 yards, 300, 200. He could see every rivet on the German fighter's fuselage, could see the pilot's head in the cockpit. At 150 yards, he opened fire. The convergence of 650 caliber machine guns produced devastating results. Each gun fired at a rate of 800 rounds per minute, meaning that in the 2-second burst, Johnson fired 72 half-inch diameter bullets reached out toward the Messerschmitt. Historical records from the Air Force Historical Research Agency note that 50 caliber rounds could penetrate fighter armor at ranges up to 500 yards. At 150 yards, they went through the Messerschmitt like paper. The German fighter disintegrated. The tail section separated from the fuselage. The canopy shattered. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. Johnson flew through the debris cloud, feeling impacts as pieces of the destroyed aircraft struck his wings and fuselage. 2 down. 28 to go. And now, finally, the entire remaining German formation had abandoned their attack on the bombers and turned to face him. One American pilot had done the impossible. He'd forced 30 German fighters to forget about 300 bomber crewmen and focus entirely on killing him. The sky transformed into a 3-dimensional battlefield of contrails and tracer fire. Johnson found himself in the center of a deadly carousel. With 28 German fighters circling like Indians around a wagon train in the Western films he'd watched as a boy in Oklahoma. But this was no Hollywood production. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts closed their circle tighter, each pilot maneuvering for a clean shot while avoiding colliding with their comrades. The volume of fire directed at Johnson's lone P-51 became almost incomprehensible cannon shells and machine gun rounds, creating a steel curtain through which he had to fly. His aircraft bore the scars of this attention. A 20mm shell had punched through his right wing, leaving a hole the size of a dinner plate. Hydraulic fluid streamed from his left aileron, creating an oily rainbow in his wake. One of his 6 guns had jammed, reducing his already limited firepower by nearly 17%. The damage assessment ran through his mind with clinical detachment even as his hands and feet worked the controls with desperate intensity. The P-51 was dying beneath him, bleeding fuel and hydraulic pressure, but it was still flying. Yes! That was all that mattered. Above the chaos, the bomber stream continued toward its target. Unmolested now that Johnson had drawn the German fighters away. Inside those bombers, 300 men continued their mission. Most never knowing that a single pilot had placed himself between them and annihilation. The B-17 crews could see the dogfight unfolding below them. A swirling tornado of aircraft contrails and tracer fire centered on one desperately maneuvering fighter. Some bombardiers abandoned their bomb sites to watch. Some gunners tracked their weapons toward the fight, unable to fire for fear of hitting the American. Some simply prayed. Johnson's ammunition counter wound down with terrifying speed. He'd started the engagement with approximately 2,400 rounds across his 6 guns. He'd already expended over 1,000 rounds in the brief engagements that had killed 2 German fighters. Basic mathematics told him he had perhaps 20 seconds of firing time remaining before his guns went silent. Once that happened, the P-51 would transform from predator to prey. Unarmed, damaged, and surrounded by enemies, his life expectancy could be measured in minutes. A Messerschmitt 109 slid into position 300 yards off his left wing, matching his turn perfectly the dreaded tracking shot where the attacking pilot had calculated his target's flight path and simply needed to wait for the perfect firing solution. Johnson could see the German pilot's face in profile, could see the man's mouth moving, probably calling the shot to his wingman, coordinating for a crossfire that would turn Johnson's Mustang into a fireball. Time seemed to slow as Johnson's options collapsed to 0. He couldn't outrun the Messerschmitt. He couldn't outturn it at his current airspeed. He couldn't dive away more Germans waited below. So he did something completely unexpected. He turned directly toward the attacking Messerschmitt. The German pilot, anticipating evasive maneuvering away from the threat according to standard defensive tactics, found himself suddenly facing a head-on attack instead. The 2 fighters rushed toward each other, closure rate exceeding 600 miles per hour. Johnson opened fire first, spending his precious remaining ammunition in a calculated gamble. His tracers reached out across the narrowing distance. The German pilot, surprised by Johnson's aggressive response, flinched. The Messerschmitt's nose dropped slightly, barely 2 degrees, but enough. Johnson's rounds went high, missing the German fighter by feet. But the psychological impact achieved what bullets couldn't. The Messerschmitt broke off. Diving away sharply, the pilot unwilling to continue the head-on engagement against an opponent clearly willing to die rather than yield. That split-second hesitation rippled through the German formation like a shockwave. Other pilots, seeing their comrade break off from a seemingly advantageous position, questioned their own commitment.
Ow.
Johnson had weaponized their uncertainty. He checked his fuel gauge. The needle hovered at 1/4 tank, far lower than it should have been given his flight time. That wing damage was worse than he'd thought. He was leaking aviation gasoline into the stratosphere, leaving a volatile trail any German pilot could follow. The mathematics turned brutal. He didn't have enough fuel to make it back to England. Even if he broke off this instant and ran for home at maximum efficiency cruise speed, he'd flame out somewhere over occupied France. The realization settled into his consciousness with surprising calm. He'd already accepted death when he'd chosen to engage 30 fighters alone. This was simply confirmation. Lieutenant Johnson's right hand ached from gripping the control stick, his left cramping from constantly adjusting throttle and mixture controls. His oxygen mask had frozen partially shut, each breath requiring conscious effort. The temperature in his damaged cockpit had dropped below zero as freezing air whistled through bullet holes in the canopy. His flight suit, designed for high-altitude cold, couldn't compensate for the wind chill. His fingers were going numb inside his leather gloves. These physical discomforts registered dimly, processed by some background part of his consciousness, while his conscious mind focused entirely on the geometry of survival. The German formation had reorganized after the initial chaos Johnson created. Their commander Johnson could identify the leader now by his aircraft's distinctive markings, and his position at the formation's apex was implementing a more disciplined approach. Instead of individual attacks, pairs of fighters took turns making coordinated runs on Johnson's Mustang, while the rest maintained position ready to exploit any opening. This was veteran pilot thinking, the kind of tactical patience that only came from surviving hundreds of hours of combat. Johnson faced not just superior numbers, but superior experience. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s dove from his high 6 o'clock, coming down out of the sun where they'd gained altitude. Perfect tactics, tack, from the target's blind spot with the sun behind you, making visual acquisition nearly impossible until too late. But Johnson had learned survival habits that operated below conscious thought. Every 5 seconds, his head rotated on a systematic scan pattern. Forward instruments, left wing, tail check through the mirror, right wing above, forward again. That tail check through the small rearview mirror mounted on his canopy saved his life for perhaps the 10th time that day. He saw them come in twin shapes diving through 4,000 feet of altitude above him, their wings reflecting sunlight in brief flashes. He had perhaps 4 seconds before they reached firing range. His damaged P-51 wouldn't withstand another coordinated attack. The aircraft's control surfaces were responding sluggishly now, the hydraulic pressure dropping toward critical levels. When the hydraulics failed completely, the control stick would become nearly immovable, requiring both hands and all his strength to maneuver the fighter. He needed to end this engagement soon, needed to break contact and attempt the impossible run for friendly territory. But the German fighters gave him no opportunity to disengage. The 2 Focke-Wulfs opened fire at extreme range, their 20mm cannon shells arcing toward him in lazy-looking trajectories that belied their lethal speed. Johnson snapped the P-51 into a hard right bank, feeling the aircraft shudder on the edge of structural failure. Metal groaned. Something tore in the left wing. He heard it even over the engine roar, a sharp crack like breaking bone. The wing flexed in ways wings weren't designed to flex, but it held. The cannon shells passed behind him, the nearest missing by a mere 20 feet nothing at these speeds and ranges. Johnson reversed his bank, going from hard right to hard left, in a maneuver that would have torn the wings off a lesser aircraft. The P-51. Mustang had earned its reputation as one of the war's finest fighters, precisely because it could absorb this kind of punishment and keep flying. But even the Mustang had limits, and Johnson was pushing past them. His ammunition counter hit 0. All 6 guns were empty. He was now flying a 400-mile-per-hour glider surrounded by enemies still carrying full ammunition loads. The situation had transitioned from desperate to objectively hopeless. Without weapons, his only value was as a decoy, keeping German attention focused on him rather than chasing the bombers. But how long could an unarmed fighter survive against 28 enemies? According to documentation preserved in post-war interrogations of Luftwaffe pilots held at the National Archives, what happened next defied standard German doctrine. The enemy formation leader, who had been observing Johnson's fighting skill for 15 minutes, made a decision that revealed the strange honor code that sometimes emerged even in total war. The German commander waggled his wings, the universal signal for "follow me," and began climbing away from Johnson's crippled Mustang. The other German fighters, though clearly confused by this order, followed their leader. They were breaking off the attack. Johnson couldn't believe what he was seeing. The German formation reformed and turned back toward their bases, leaving him alone in the sky with a dying aircraft and empty guns. Later analysis suggested the German commander recognized Johnson's ammunition state by the absence of return fire and made a calculated decision. His squadron had already lost 2 fighters trying to kill 1 American. With the bomber raid continuing and German oil production desperately needed, wasting more time and potentially losing more pilots trying to kill an already neutralized enemy made no tactical sense. Better to return to base, rearm, and intercept the bombers on their return journey. Or perhaps in that moment, one professional warrior recognized another's courage and made the rare choice to let a worthy opponent live. The silence after the German fighters departed seemed louder than the combat had been. Johnson's cockpit filled with sounds previously masked by battle, the labored coughing of his damaged Merlin engine, the whistle of wind through bullet holes, the creak of stressed metal throughout the airframe. His hands trembled on the controls. Now that adrenaline was fading, replaced by the shakes that always came after combat, he'd survived. Against impossible odds, outnumbered 30-1, he'd survived. But survival was a relative term at 22,000 feet over Germany in a dying aircraft. The fuel gauge read nearly empty. The warning light glowed red on his instrument panel. Johnson calculated distances with the cold logic pilots develop when fuel becomes more precious than gold. England lay approximately 300 miles northwest. His maximum range on remaining fuel, accounting for the leak in his right-wing tank, gave him perhaps 150 miles before the engine quit. Basic subtraction meant he would crash somewhere in occupied Europe. The best-case scenario involved bailing out over Allied-controlled territory or reaching neutral Switzerland. Worst case, and most likely he'd come down in Germany and spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp. If he survived the bailout, if the Germans who captured him didn't shoot him on sight in revenge for the 2 fighters he'd destroyed. He checked his position against the navigation chart strapped to his thigh. The bomber stream was now 60 miles ahead, safely beyond German fighter range, and headed back toward England. His radio crackled with chatter, other P-51 pilots reporting their positions. Bomber formations checking in with damage assessments, rescue frequencies, monitoring for emergency calls. Johnson keyed his microphone, about to announce his situation, then hesitated. Broadcasting his position meant German listening posts would triangulate his location. Every German fighter within 100 miles would vector toward him, eager for an easy kill against a damaged, unarmed opponent.
He would maintain radio silence and try to nurse the crippled Mustang as far west as possible before the inevitable engine failure. The P-51 began a slow descent. Johnson couldn't maintain altitude on 1.5 damaged wing tanks and a sputtering engine, 18,000 feet. 15,000, 12,000. The earth below transformed from abstract terrain viewed from altitude into recognizable features: forests, rivers, roads, towns. He was descending into the world of anti-aircraft guns and small arms fire, where every German soldier with a rifle would shoot at an American fighter. At 8,000 feet, he'd be within easy range of light flak guns. At 2,000 feet, even rifle fire could bring him down. The engine coughed, sputtered, resumed running, coughed again. Johnson's eyes locked on the fuel gauge as the needle touched empty and kept falling, driven by fuel pressure alone. Any second now, the Packard-built Merlin would run dry and quit. The propeller would windmill uselessly as the aircraft transformed into a glider with the aerodynamic efficiency of a brick. He'd have perhaps 2 minutes to find a suitable crash landing site or bail out. He scanned the terrain below with trained eyes, categorizing potential landing sites with the checklist learned at flight school. Fields were preferable long, flat, clear of obstacles. Trees were death. Water depended on depth and current. Roads seemed tempting, but were usually too narrow and lined with poles or trees. He spotted a rectangular field about 3 miles ahead, maybe 1,000 yards long, oriented northeast-southwest. Not ideal, but possibly survivable. The engine quit. The sudden silence was absolute and terrifying. The propeller continued spinning from windmilling, but the power that had kept Johnson alive for the past hour vanished. The P-51 became 4,300 pounds of aluminum, steel, and flesh descending toward Earth at a rate determined purely by physics and gravity. Johnson trimmed the aircraft for best glide speed 220 miles per hour and pointed the nose toward that rectangular field. At 5,000 feet, he realized his glide path would fall short by a quarter mile. The field that had seemed possible at 8,000 feet now lay tantalizingly out of reach. He'd come down in forest-all pines that would shred the Mustang like tissue paper and almost certainly kill him in the process. His hand moved to the canopy release. Better to bail out at altitude and take his chances with German soldiers than die in a crash. Then, at 3,000 feet, the engine coughed once more. Impossibly, incredibly, it caught again. Fuel trapped somewhere in the lines, perhaps pooling in low spots. Perhaps just fumes vaporizing in the fuel pump provided 3 more seconds of power. 3 seconds at full throttle. The propeller bit air, the P-51 surged forward and upward. Johnson aimed straight for the field like an arrow, praying the fuel would last another 10 seconds. Just 10 seconds. The engine quit again, finally and permanently, but those 3 seconds of power had been enough. The field lay directly ahead now, reachable, survivable, at 500 feet above the field. Johnson ran through the emergency landing checklist with mechanical precision, despite the adrenaline screaming through his bloodstream. Canopy locked open if he crashed. Being trapped inside a burning aircraft was a death sentence worse than impact. Shoulder harness tight. The harness could break ribs during impact, but broken ribs were preferable to going through the windscreen. Radio to emergency frequency. He survived the crash but couldn't walk away. Rescuers needed to know where to look, even if those rescuers wore German uniforms. The field rushed up at him with terrible speed. 200 feet. 150. At 100 feet, he could distinguish individual features. Was a cultivated field. Recently harvested, with stubble rows running perpendicular to his approach. Not ideal. The stubble would catch his landing gear and possibly flip the aircraft. But he had no choice of approach angle now. Physics had taken over. He was a passenger in a controlled crash at 50 feet. He pulled the stick back, flaring the P-51 to bleed off airspeed. The aircraft responded sluggishly with its damaged hydraulics and torn wing. 20 feet 10. The landing gear touched Earth at 120 miles per hour, roughly twice the speed of a normal landing. The impact slammed Johnson against his shoulder harness hard enough to see stars. The P-51 bounced, became briefly airborne again, came down harder. The right main gear collapsed with a tortured shriek of metal. The aircraft slewed right, the wingtip digging into Earth. Everything became chaos and noise. The Mustang cartwheeled, the nose plowing into dirt, the tail flipping over. Johnson's world inverted, then inverted again. Equipment tore loose inside the cockpit. Maps, instruments, anything not welded down became projectiles. Something struck his helmet, a glancing blow that would have crushed his skull without the leather protection. The windscreen shattered. Dirt and grass blasted through the open canopy, blinding him. Then, as suddenly as it began, the violence stopped. The P-51 came to rest inverted, Johnson hanging from his shoulder harness with his head pointing toward the ground and his feet toward sky. Fuel dripped somewhere. He could smell the distinctive aviation gasoline odor. Fire was inevitable. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the friction-heated metal ignited fuel fumes and transformed the aircraft into an inferno. His hands fumbled with the harness release, fingers clumsy from the impact and adrenaline. The release mechanism was jammed or bent from the crash. He hung suspended, unable to free himself, while gasoline pooled on the ground beneath his head. 20 seconds to fire. His survival knife hung on his belt. He drew it with his left hand and began sawing at the shoulder harness webbing. The fabric was thick, designed to prevent tearing during crashes, which now worked against him. 15 seconds. The knife cut through the first strap. He dropped another 6 inches, now hanging by one remaining strap. His head touched the pooling gasoline. The fumes made his eyes water. 10 seconds. The second strap parted. He fell onto his head and shoulders, a painful impact cushioned slightly by the soft earth. 5 seconds. He scrambled out from under the wreckage, his flight suit soaked with gasoline, his hands slipping on the fuselage as he dragged himself clear. He'd made it 20 feet from the inverted Mustang when the aircraft ignited. The fireball expanded outward in a rolling orange and black cloud. The heat wave knocked him flat, singeing his hair and eyebrows. He crawled another 10 feet, then 20, then 50 before collapsing in the stubble field, watching his aircraft burn. The P-51 that had carried him through combat against 30 German fighters, that had absorbed punishment that should have torn it apart, that had given its last gasp of power to reach this field, was gone, reduced to twisted metal and toxic smoke. Johnson lay in the field, catching his breath, taking inventory of his body. Everything hurt, but nothing felt broken. His ribs ached from the harness impact. His head throbbed where something had struck his helmet. His hands bled from a dozen small cuts. But he was alive. The realization settled over him with strange detachment. He'd fought 30 German fighters single-handedly, saved 300 bomber crewmen, survived being shot to pieces, crash-landed in enemy territory, and escaped a burning aircraft with seconds to spare. And now, lying in a field somewhere in Germany, with the afternoon sun warming his face and the smell of burning aluminum in his nostrils. Lieutenant Robert Johnson faced a new challenge, evading capture and making it back to Allied lines. The war wasn't finished with him yet. Movement at the tree line caught his eye. Figures emerged from the forest, running toward him across the field. German soldiers. Johnson forced himself to his feet, despite every muscle-screaming protest. The German soldiers were perhaps 200 yards away, moving cautiously with weapons at the ready. 5 men in Wehrmacht grey-green uniforms, likely a patrol from a nearby garrison that had seen the crash and come to investigate. Standard procedure would be to capture the downed pilot before he could destroy sensitive equipment or documentation. Johnson's squadron codes, radio frequencies, and mission details were written on documents in his flight suit pockets. If captured, he'd become an intelligence asset for the enemy. He began running toward the opposite tree line, his flight boots awkward in the soft earth. Behind him, shouts in German. Warning shots cracked overhead, the distinctive sound of Mauser rifles. The Germans weren't shooting to kill yet. They wanted him alive for interrogation. That would change if he reached the forest. Once in the trees, they'd have no choice but to hunt him like an animal. And wounded animals were shot on sight. His lungs burned. The oxygen deprivation from high-altitude flying, combined with the physical trauma of the crash and the desperate sprint, had reduced his endurance dramatically. He'd covered perhaps 50 yards when his legs began to fail. 75 yards, 100. The tree line remained 100 yards distant, impossibly far. The German soldiers behind him were closing the gap. They were fresh, uninjured, and motivated by duty and possibly the promise of recognition for capturing an American pilot. Johnson's boot caught on a stubble row. He went down hard, face first into the dirt. He tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. Behind him, the sound of running boots grew louder. He rolled onto his back, raising his hands in surrender. There was no dishonor in this. He'd fought beyond all reasonable limits, beyond what any commander could have asked. He'd saved 300 men and destroyed 2 German fighters in the process. Capture was an acceptable end to the day's work. The German soldiers surrounded him, weapons pointed at his chest. Their faces were young, none looked older than 25. One had sergeant's stripes. The sergeant barked orders in German. Rough hands searched Johnson, removing his sidearm, his survival knife, his documents. They pulled him to his feet, securing his wrists with wire that bit into his skin. One soldier, barely 18 by his appearance, stared at Johnson with undisguised awe, then pointed at the burning Mustang and said something in German. The sergeant responded, his tone sharper reprimand. But Johnson caught the gist. The young soldier had asked if Johnson was the pilot who'd fought the 30 fighters. Word had spread somehow, probably by radio from the German fighter unit. The soldier had called him Der verrückte Amerikaner, the crazy American. The sergeant's reprimand probably related to showing respect to an enemy, but even the sergeant glanced at Johnson with something that might have been professional respect. They marched him toward the tree line, heading east toward what Johnson assumed was their garrison. The walk took 40 minutes through dense forest along a path invisible to Johnson but clearly familiar to his captors. The sergeant led 2 soldiers flanked Johnson, 2 more brought up the rear. Nobody spoke. Johnson's mind raced through the escape and evasion training he'd received at flight school. The standard advice was to attempt escape during the first 24 hours of captivity before reaching a permanent POW facility where security would be tighter. But escape required opportunity, and his guards were professionals. They kept their distance, maintained overlapping fields of fire, and never let him near potential weapons. The wire around his wrists had been twisted by someone who knew how to immobilize a prisoner. Johnson's hands were already going numb from restricted circulation. The garrison appeared through the Treaser small compound with 3 wooden buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence. A guard tower stood at one corner, unmanned at the moment. The entire facility had the temporary look of a unit rotating through this position, rather than a permanent installation. Perhaps a dozen soldiers moved around the compound on various duties. This was likely a communications relay station or supply depot rather than a frontline position. The sergeant led Johnson into the largest building, a single-story structure with a radio aerial on the roof. Inside, a Luftwaffe officer sat behind a desk covered with paperwork and maps. The officer looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing as he took in Johnson's flight suit and condition. He stood, revealing himself to be a captain by his insignia. The Wehrmacht sergeant saluted and delivered a rapid report in German. The Luftwaffe captain walked around his desk and stood directly in front of Johnson, studying him with intense interest. Then, in heavily accented but grammatically correct English, he spoke, "You are Lieutenant Robert Johnson." "Yes." Serial number. He glanced at documents taken from Johnson's pockets, 3-7-2-9-4-5-8. "You are the pilot who engaged 30 fighters alone over the bomber stream." It wasn't a question. Johnson remained silent, remembering the Geneva Convention requirements: name, rank, and serial number only. The Luftwaffe captain studied Johnson for a long moment, then gestured to a chair. "Please sit. You are injured and exhausted. The war will continue without us discussing it for a few moments." When Johnson hesitated, the captain added, "I am Captain Werner Hoffmann, formerly of Jagdgeschwader 26. I was a fighter pilot before becoming administrative staff. We are not barbarians, Lieutenant. You will be treated according to the rules of war." Johnson sat, his bound wrists making the position awkward. Captain Hoffman barked orders to the Wehrmacht sergeant, who left and returned moments later with bread, sausage, and water. Hoffman gestured for the wire restraints to be cut. "You will not attempt escape from this room. Yes. There are 5 armed soldiers outside the door. It would be foolish and fatal." Johnson nodded, rubbing his wrists as circulation returned painfully. He ate mechanically while Hoffman watched. The food was basic, but filling German army rations, probably the same food the garrison soldiers ate. The water was cold and clean. Johnson drank 3 cups before his thirst was satisfied. Hoffman sat on the edge of his desk, arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. "The radio reports from our fighter unit were quite extraordinary. They say one P-51 attacked 30 aircraft and forced them to abandon their attack on the bomber stream. They say this one pilot destroyed 2 fighters and damaged 3 more before his ammunition was exhausted. They say he fought for," Hoffman glanced at a paper, 17 minutes against impossible odds. He paused. "They say the formation leader called you der Tapferst, find the bravest enemy." Johnson maintained silence, though his heart beat faster. The intelligence Hoffman was casually revealing could be valuable if Johnson ever escaped and made it back to Allied lines. The Germans were discussing their own losses and tactical decisions openly. Either Hoffman was extraordinarily careless or he was conducting interrogation through seemingly casual conversation. "You are wondering why I tell you these things," Hoffman continued, reading Johnson's expression accurately. "It is because you already know them. You were there. I tell you nothing you have not experienced." He walked to a map on the wall showing German military dispositions, though Johnson noticed it was probably outdated or deliberately inaccurate. "What I wish to know, Lieutenant Johnson, is this. Why? Why did you not call for help? Why did you not retreat when you saw you were outnumbered? Why did you choose certain death to protect bombers that were not even in your immediate squadron responsibility?" The question hung in the air. Johnson understood that answering would violate his obligation to provide only name, rank, and serial number. But he also understood that some questions deserved answers, even between enemies. "Because 300 men were depending on me," he said quietly. "Because I was the only one in position to help them. Because that's what we do."